Welcome into the Andrew Garrison Show. My name, of course, is Andrew Garrison, speaking to you from a dorm room at Indiana University with much to discuss this afternoon. It is about 2:30 p.m. Eastern on Thursday, January 28th. A great day, and there has been a lot of sports taking place that I would love to discuss today. We're going to talk about three teams. We're going to talk about three games/matches. We're going to talk about IU Wrestling first. They, first of all, last Friday, were shut out by number one Penn State on the road, but we're primarily going to discuss the contest that occurred on Monday, postponed from Sunday, which was the home win in a duel against Michigan State that sort of brought Indiana's duel record in the Big Ten to 2-2. We're going to talk about Indiana women's basketball because on Sunday they lost in West Lafayette against Purdue. I believe 80 to 69 was the score. We'll check by the time we talk about that team a little bit later on. Before then, though, we're going to talk about Nebraska Wrestling. They had a very, very important weekend. They lost to Iowa. They didn't look very good. They looked a whole lot better against number 2 Ohio State, but still ultimately lost. We're going to talk a little bit about that duel. We're going to talk a little bit about Nebraska. I watched a lot of Nebraska wrestling this past weekend, kind of in preparation for their duel against Indiana in a few weeks. I've also been watching a decent amount of Purdue. Not going to talk about them today, but possibly will at some point in the coming days and weeks. Either way, again, lots to discuss. A lot of sports went down. It's Thursday. I wish I would have been able to podcast a little bit earlier in the week. Schedules got all messed up with obviously the winter storm that has rolled through the Midwest, obviously Bloomington, and much of America across the board, especially on the East Coast and in the Midwest. It nearly took a wrestling duel off the schedule in Bloomington, but it did not. It's going to take a little bit more than snow to keep the Indiana Hoosiers away from beating the Michigan State Spartans. So that's exactly what happened on Monday afternoon and evening. Indiana 32, Michigan State 13, and that wrestling duel. Overall, this weekend was a very notable one for Indiana, obviously going on the road to number one Penn State, and as many teams, including fellow top 5 teams like Iowa, Indiana was not able to score any team points in that duel, not able to pick up any wins in individual matchups. So they lose 48-0 on the road against Penn State. Obviously very unfortunate, but there's kind of the built-in caveat of knowing that in a couple days they're going to come back to Bloomington and they're going to take on Michigan State. Obviously, travel was surely difficult because a lot of planes were shut down, a lot of flights were canceled or moved around with the weather. You also have the situation where you don't know that the match is going to be postponed. You don't know the duel is going to be postponed until kind of the day of or potentially the night before. And so obviously we find out very late. I was on the broadcast for Big Ten Plus. I was dressed. I had my dress shoes on. I was putting my coat on, ready to leave. And then, of course, see a Microsoft Outlook notification and realize that the duel is actually the next day, which was a little bit relieving because it was going to be a very treacherous walk for myself, to get from obviously where I live to the stadium, to Wilkinson Hall, rather. Nonetheless, match was postponed. It's business as usual for the Hoosiers. The snow and the Spartans is not enough to prevent them from having success. A 32-13 win for Indiana. The primary takeaways here, it's really a lot of reinforcement of what we already knew, right? When you see teams in any sport, but even in wrestling, almost especially in wrestling, when you see teams take on inferior opponents or in theory, inferior competition, we know that Michigan State, with all due respect, is one of the lower teams in the Big Ten. We know that they have not yet won a duel in the Big Ten Conference play, and they've wrestled more than most teams have. I think they're 0-4. 0-3, 0-4. I think 0-4 now after the loss to Indiana. 0-3 at the time, perhaps. And so they've struggled, right? And so obviously the Big Ten's a very difficult league and things like that. But Michigan State has 2 ranked wrestlers, if I'm not mistaken. And across the board, they definitely don't stack up as well with many of their opponents in the Big Ten, Indiana clearly being one of them. And so you kind of, anytime you see a team play against one of inferior status, you kind of see the strengths illuminated, right? And that obviously shows just how great a given team is if they're winning by so much. But the bright spots of this Indiana roster were illuminated even more than they typically are in this matchup against Michigan State. And namely, that's Jacob Moran at 125, right, to open up duels. And you also have the heavier half of the lineup. And both of those were obviously great. So Indiana, they win the first 4 matches out of the break. So you got the halftime break, 5 in the first half, 5 in the second half, the unofficial first and second half. They win 4 right out of the break. That was also compounded with a win right before the break. I would believe it was Bryce Lowry with a regular decision win right before we went to halftime, and then 4 wins right after that. And it's because a lot of those wrestlers, almost all of those wrestlers, are indeed ranked. Now, Caleb Marzolino was pinned at heavyweight by Josh Terrell, but other than that, the second half, the heavier half of the lineup was absolutely phenomenal for Indiana, once again, as it often is. It's a lot of ranked wrestlers against unranked wrestlers. We'll go through each of the duels, each of the bouts, one by one, and kind of have a couple words on each of them. But across the board, the primary takeaway, Moran is awesome at the beginning, and the heavier half of the lineup is awesome. And so if Indiana can just stay competitive, really what it comes down to for me is this, right? Because Indiana's going to go to Illinois on Friday. That's a big one. They're going to go to Wisconsin next week. That's another big one, right? And so in those somewhat evenly matched duels, in those somewhat evenly matched meets, it's important that Indiana is at least competitive and within maybe 1 or 2 wins, within the reach of 1 or 2 wins of the opponent at the halftime break, right? Because again, Indiana's strength is at the heavyweight, so if they're just in contention, it's very possible that they storm back and surge ahead in the second half. And a big part of that as well, ironically, is the lightest of the lightweights for Indiana, Jacob Moran, because he's been fantastic. I wrote a piece. There's a social clip out on IUSTV Sports about this from me. There's an article on the Media School Student Journal about this from me, and it's about Jacob Moran and how he's awesome, right? He's a graduate student. He's incredibly experienced. He's number 11 in the country at his weight class, at least at the time. And he starts most duels, right? Most duels begin at 125 pounds. And so he steps onto the mat and immediately he often finds success and he often finds bonus points. And he had bonus points with a technical fall victory against Corday. And so against Nick Corday, again, in the matchup against Michigan State. And so for Moran, a lot of times, obviously there's the mentorship and practice, obviously there's the leadership across the board, but it's also just the exemplary energy and intensity on the mat right away, where immediately you see Jacob Moran with consistent offense. He's incredibly difficult to keep down, right? It's just fantastic wrestling. Sometimes the very best wrestling you'll see from Indiana all day long, even on a good day for the team, is at the very beginning with Jacob Moran at 125 pounds. So that example that he sets kind of, and that tone that he sets, the energy that he establishes on the mat, very much, in my opinion, carries over to the next guys who are, again, in the lighter weights, often unranked or young or both, right? And so Moran plays a key role at the very beginning. Unfortunately, against Michigan State, that energy and intensity and success didn't necessarily transfer to the other lightweights in the same way. You see kind of every other match go the way of the Hoosiers and then the other one going the way of the Spartans. You see Moran win. Blaine Frazier lost by regular decision. You saw Joey Butler lose a couple matchups later, right? So it was an interesting. There wasn't a lot of momentum established for Indiana, and really for either side. But that was kind of taken with a grain of salt, with the understanding that Indiana was going to dominate the second half of the meet, and that's exactly what happened. But again, Moran with that technical fall, consistent offense, exemplary energy. He was absolutely phenomenal throughout that bout. And obviously ultimately has the technical fall victory over Nick Corday as a result. But again, that's just to start off matches that way, to start off bouts, to start off duels that way is massively beneficial to Indiana, to have someone like Jacob Moran, especially knowing that he's a graduate student with a ton of experience. So that was very, very good to see for Indiana. It was followed up by number 30, Caleb Williams, nearly being upset by Blaine Frazier of Indiana. And 133 has... I don't know if I want to call it a problem area because I like Blaine Frazier and I like Logan Frazier, but it's an area where Indiana is not quite fully determined, as far as we can tell, which wrestler is really going to, take the helm at 133. We've seen both Blaine and Logan Frazier, step onto the mat in important duels and in important moments. I believe Logan was either injured or sick, so I don't know if he would have. I knew he was unavailable, is the point. I don't know exactly what the issue was, but I know he was unavailable against Michigan State. So I'm not sure if he would have taken the mat had he been available rather than Blaine. But Blaine performed very, very well against number 30, Caleb Williams, and he ultimately was up by 2 and riding late in the third period. Had a prime opportunity, had a ton of riding time, like something like 3 or 4 minutes of riding time, right? So he's just been dominating on top. He has a 2-point lead at the end of regulation, and then there's an escape. Let me see if I can remember this exactly correctly, because So he had the 2-point lead, and then there's a late takedown or a reversal from Weand. He scored late, and it canceled out the riding time point. I don't have the exact math lined up in my head, but he scores in the very, very, very final moments, and so that cancels out the riding time point. At the time, the match was tied. Oh, that's right. So the match was tied, but it was 3-3 or something along those lines. It was 3-3. And Frazier had the riding time point far secured. So he just had to ride out the very end. And then we had popped out and escaped in the very last moments. And that obviously tied it up, canceled out the riding time point, which was just devastating because in one moment, there's an escape that's worth 1 point. And then 4 minutes of riding time is just completely thrown out the window. And they go to sudden victory. We ultimately ended up proving to be the better wrestler from neutral in this matchup. And he obviously ultimately ended up grabbing the takedown to win in sudden victory 7-4. Super unfortunate for Frazier because that would have been a huge win. He's a guy with a losing record across the board and a losing record in duels. And to pick up that ranked win would have, especially on his own mat, would have been huge. And obviously wasn't quite able to do so, but wrestled very, very well and nearly was able to obviously knock off a ranked wrestler, at that weight class. Then you have number 25 Henry Porter respond with a technical fall win over Sean Larkin. Immediately, that momentum is kind of reduced and dissipated as well because Joey Butler lost by a major decision to Evan Gause. Gause found back points. It was a crazy first period. Butler, just very unfortunate sequence. Gause ultimately ends up concluding the first period with a 10-1 lead. He did so via back points, great near fall positions, super uncomfortable clearly for Butler. That lead, Butler had a good second period. He looked better the rest of the way, but Gause was able to kind of reestablish those near fall points and reestablish that control in the third. And ultimately, that big lead was just too steep to come back from for Butler. So Gause, very good on top, very good turning takedowns into near fall points, and honestly, pins. That would have been twice, both in the first period and the third period. That probably would have been a pin if he's wrestling just about anyone other than Joey Butler. Butler obviously was able to defend fairly well there, but Butler loves the scramble. He wasn't really able to scramble much in this matchup. And again, Gause just looked fantastic for Michigan State. And that great first period, a very, very unfortunate series of events for Butler, ultimately leads to a blowout loss, bonus points for Michigan State. So the teams were trading bonus points back and forth, and it was really unclear how the rest of this first half was going to go. Again, there's an understanding that Indiana is probably going to win the duel no matter what because they have there's too many weight classes where they had a ranked wrestler and Michigan State didn't. And the Hoosiers had obviously great ranked wrestlers and Michigan State didn't have ranked wrestlers at all. And so it's definitely on the back half of this one, it's expected that Indiana was probably going to win, and they did. Bryce Lowry had a regular decision win over Darius Marinas. Marinas is a guy for Michigan State that I think really, really wrestles well. Lowry's been flirting with the rankings. He was ranked last week, if I'm not mistaken, not this week. And then Marinas nearly knocks off Lowry. Marinas has had some great opportunities and he wrestled Stoney Buell, if I'm not mistaken, number 24, very, very well against Purdue the few days prior on that Friday. I don't quote me on whether or not that's Stoney Buell, but regardless, there's a very strong ranked wrestler at this weight class for Purdue, and Marinas was great. But Marinas has been fighting tough and hanging tough in a lot of these matchups. Lowry's a great example. Not a win, but a tough one for Lowry for sure. You got number 19, and then you have the halftime breaks. We alternate wins. Indiana wins every other in the first half. They win 3. Michigan State wins 2. We end with Bryce Lowry getting a regular decision win to carry Indiana into the break with momentum. And then it's 4 straight. It ends up being 5 straight. It's number 19, Tyler Lillard with a technical fall over DJ Shannon. It's number 29, Derek Gilcher knocking off Connor O'Neill. It's number 13, Sam Goen pinning Luke Venadia. That was a big one in the post-game press conference, which I was in. He said that it was an expected pin, but very late there, Sam Goen just kept working at it and was able to work that pin over Luke Venadia, who obviously is a very strong wrestler. You got number 15, Gabe Sollers with a regular decision win over number 27, Cale Whistler. And then at the ends, you have Josh Terrell for Michigan State with the fall over Caleb Marzolino. But again, we have reinforcement on the ideas that we have been holding in recent times, right? Where there's the understanding that Indiana is great from great on the back half of the lineup, great on the heavier half of the lineup, great obviously to start with Moran. Could have been way more dominant. Certainly some of those toss-up matchups, Butler totally could have beaten Gause. I think a lot of times Butler comes out on top against Gause, or at least doesn't give up bonus points. Brain Frazier certainly could have won at 133, so could have been a whole lot better for Indiana. There's a world where they win 9, they win their first 9, and then obviously probably in most worlds lose at heavyweight with Caleb Marcelino. But this Indiana team, I mean, again, they had a couple mishaps there, but clearly there's a lot of strength and a lot of quality. They were scoring points against Penn State. They were securing takedowns. That's not something that has happened every single year for Indiana. They moved up in the rankings from number 25 to number 24 after these results, and they just look good, and I enjoyed it. And I enjoyed watching them, and I look forward to watching them again at some point very, very soon. Speaking of, they'll go to Illinois. I don't know why. Well, I do know why. There's a Big Ten Network triple header, and so Indiana and Illinois ended up being the last matchup in that triple header. They will wrestle at 10 p.m. on Friday night, which is bonkers, against Illinois. Do not believe they wrestle on Sunday. They'll wrestle at Wisconsin the week after, and then again the next week they'll be against Nebraska. I believe still number 6 Nebraska, and they will face that team inside Wilkinson Hall, or at least in Bloomington. So that will be very, very interesting for Indiana. I'll be there for IUSTV. I will be there for the Media School Student Journal, and we'll see sort of how that matchup ultimately goes. I'll obviously be watching the road matchups on TV, and I'm interested to see how the Illinois one plays out and Wisconsin plays out. Because if Indiana wins both, this is a real team, and this is a team that has a lot of great opportunities to potentially go far in Big Ten, NCAA's, especially if there's some big upset wins. Wisconsin is a team that I would imagine Indiana probably has the ability to beat. We'll see. Illinois, not so much, a little bit of a steeper battle. But again, if Indiana goes 2 for 2 there, they're looking great. If they go 0 for 2, obviously not so much. If they go 1 for 1 or 1-1, they probably will go 1 for 2 in this stretch, just because you know how wrestling is. Number 10 Illinois or whatever they are, probably going to beat number 24 Indiana. Have to look at that duel match by match and see sort of how things line up. But more than likely, they lose to Illinois, they beat Wisconsin, and then they take on Nebraska. But we'll have to find out. I'm interested to see how the Illinois match goes. I like that team a lot. I'm super excited to watch them, especially against the Hoosiers. And it'll be interesting to see how that one plays out, because I think it could be a little bit closer than many people are anticipating, especially because of how great Indiana is, again, on the heavier half of the lineup. That's all I have on Indiana. I want to talk about Nebraska wrestling, because I also watched both Nebraska matchups. Only 2 teams that I watched. I guess I watched both Purdue. I watched both Purdue duels, but I watched Indiana versus Penn State. I watched Indiana versus Michigan State. I also watched Nebraska versus Iowa and Nebraska versus Ohio State. So some very highly ranked wrestling. Probably why I enjoyed it so much. Nebraska has the best fans that I've come across as a college wrestling enjoyer in the last few weeks. The Nebraska home crowd, obviously great for the Iowa match rather. Not as great with the snowstorm, but still very, very good against Ohio State. I'm going to focus on the Ohio State duel, because that one ended 17-16. It came down to the heavyweights. It was very exciting. I'll touch on the Iowa matchup, though, because Nebraska simply didn't look very good. A lot of those toss-up matchups, especially early on, went the way of the Hawkeyes, and the Hawkeyes just looked like they came to wrestle and were ready to go, and Nebraska not so much. Nebraska ultimately ends up losing 22-14 to Iowa. Iowa, a little bit higher ranked, I think number 4 in the country. Obviously, Ohio State, I believe, number 2, and then Nebraska something like number 6. Number 4 versus number 6, right, or something like that, a situation where it's 2 top 10 teams, but Iowa's a little bit higher ranked, but it's in Nebraska's building, and Iowa did look significantly better than Nebraska, which absolutely concerned me. And Nebraska is similar to Indiana in the sense that the strength is on the heavier half of the lineup, but again, against Ohio State and against Iowa, some strong starts for the opponents, right, of Nebraska, particularly with Iowa. Nebraska makes it interesting late, but for the most part, it's 22-14. It was worse than that for a long time between Nebraska and Iowa. Iowa looked great. Nebraska didn't look very good. Iowa picks up a big win on the road. Again, against Ohio State, they built up a significant lead against Nebraska, and they worked back into it, chipping away in the second half, in the heavier half of the lineup. A lot of time spent in overtime, a lot of time spent in sudden victory. Nebraska manages to work their way back in to the point where they prevented Ohio State from scoring enough bonus points to where Nebraska was very much in that matchup, to the point where at the heavyweight battle between number 3 Nick Feldman and between number 4 AJ Ferrari, Nebraska was in it. It's just it's the difference of a regular decision, right? Between Nebraska and Ohio State, all Ferrari had to do was win. It was a 2-point differential. And ultimately, Ohio State managed to come away with the victory. That was Nick Feldman winning at heavyweight. That kind of spoils one of the matchups we're going to talk about. But again, Nebraska didn't look good against Iowa. Ohio State survives the second half surge, similar to Iowa, although it was a whole lot closer between Nebraska and number 2 Ohio State. So some great improvement to go from really not looking good against number 4 to looking very capable of beating number 2. Huge for Nebraska, especially in the same weekend. So I appreciated that improvement. And again, it was kind of astonishing watching on TV. After seeing how great Ohio State looked out of the gate, you obviously see Jesse Mendez wrestle fantastically. And then you get to a point late there where Nebraska's in it, and Minto picks up a big win, which we'll talk about. And then you get to heavyweight, and you look around, and it's the crowd's into it. The crowd's, really hype, and you realize, wow, Nebraska really could win this. They really could knock off number 2 Ohio State. They were not quite able to do so, but again, very, very close. So still a whole lot of quality in Nebraska. I trust their ability to improve throughout the rest of the season. Obviously, they improved very well between Friday and Sunday, and so it'll be interesting to see how Nebraska wrestles the rest of the way. I think they're against Penn State on Friday, which will be super interesting to watch as well, just to see how they stack up against the Nittany Lions. But across the board, right, Nebraska wins, but they never win against the top 5. There's a real stat where they're undefeated. I believe they're undefeated, except for against top 5 opponents, right? They lost to Oklahoma State. They've lost to Ohio State, of course. They lost to Iowa, right? So they win, but never against the top 5, never against the very, very best. And so that seems to be the difference between Nebraska and the elite of the elite in college wrestling. However, my counterpoint to that idea is the fact that, again, so many different ways that Nebraska could have won against Ohio State. It was ultimately a 1-point duel. It was ultimately came down to sudden victory at the heavyweight level, right? Stalling calls were very much in play at that time as well. So there's totally a world where Nebraska is capable of beating Ohio State. Granted, in Lincoln, but nonetheless, Nebraska against Ohio State, Nebraska looked very much in it and would have deserved the victory had they ultimately achieved victory. So I think Nebraska's closer to that elite of the elite than maybe we think. Obviously, Penn State's a whole nother level, but Nebraska and Ohio State, it's not a super big difference between those two, even if it looked like it when Nebraska took on Iowa. So if Nebraska improves throughout the season, we could see some more national championship contenders and Big Ten championship contenders on the side of the Cornhuskers. But again, they win. They just don't win against the top 5. They'll have another opportunity against Penn State on Friday. They'll have opportunities throughout the rest of the season to get some big wins as well, especially because of how great the Big Ten is. And obviously, all of these guys individually will have opportunities against some of the top wrestlers in the country at the Big Ten tournaments, in the Big Ten championships, and then obviously in the NCAA championships as well. The 3 most notable matches for me in this game, or in this duel rather. At 141, number 1 Jesse Mendez of Ohio State scored 14 points, and number 3 Brock Hardy scored 3. That's a major decision victory for Jesse Mendez. Mendez had an early slide-by takedown. He had 2 takedowns in period 1 that resulted in near fall points. He racked up a nice early lead. It ultimately was just a statement major decision, right? I believe these two took each other on at some point in the NCAA championships last year, perhaps the Big Ten championships, perhaps both. And it was close, right? Mendez and Hardy, these two typically are close with one another. We anticipated that heading into this one again as well. Hardy with a hard-fought win against Iowa a couple days prior. And again, Mendez with just a blowout victory, 14-3, a major decision. Mendez scored bonus points against number 3 in his weight class. Very, very impressive from Mendez. And maybe, probably, certainly, definitely, the 141 Big Ten and National Championship runs through number 1 Jesse Mendez. But he looked far better than I had anticipated ever seeing him in this contest. Able to take down number 3 Brock Hardy by major decision. That's a huge deal for the Buckeyes and a huge deal for Mendez. And again, very, very dangerous. Arguably at the top of his game right now. He looked great against Hardy, and he looked great across the board. At 174, I really enjoyed this matchup, mostly because I really enjoy watching Christopher Minto wrestle. It's number 4 Carson Kartla of Ohio State and number 6 Christopher Minto of Nebraska. Minto with a slight upset in sudden victory. The difference was a takedown. Minto scrambled and defended well. Both scrambled and defended well between these two, right? Obviously, ultimately, at the very top of wrestling, it's very hard to take these guys down. And both Minto and Kartla proved that idea with ease. Against this matchup looked very similar to the matchup with Minto against Iowa. And Minto couldn't win just because he couldn't initiate enough offense. He could defend, right, and he could scramble. But eventually his opponent was initiating more offense, and obviously Minto was going to be taken down eventually, and that's exactly what happened. This time, though, Minto stuck with his shots. He was creating offense. He was being proactive on that side of the mat, and ultimately ended up grabbing the takedown late in sudden victory to win and to get this slight upset win over Carson Karchula. We know Minto's phenomenal defensively. I love watching him wrestle defensively. We know he's awesome in that way. And he was able to put together the offense late in order to, clutch up and snag a victory against number 4. That is a huge deal. And again, I love Christopher Minto. He's just something about him. It's mostly on defense. I just love watching him, take the mat. And this time actually picking up this big win, because watching it play out, I was like, okay, I wasn't actually tempted to skip forward, but if I didn't really care, I would have been tempted to skip forward, because I felt like I had seen this same song and dance wrestled out a little bit earlier. Obviously, they wrestled Iowa on Friday. I actually watched that matchup on Sunday morning, and then watched the women's basketball game, which we'll talk about later, and then watched Nebraska versus Ohio State live on Sunday afternoon. So I had felt like I had literally just watched this exact same match a couple hours ago, and I kind of had, and Minto obviously lost that one in sudden victory. And this time against Ohio State, again, able to initiate enough offense to ultimately score and win against a higher-ranked opponent, a huge, huge deal. So not only was this critical to the duel, because this indirectly extended. This was the big one, because I don't know if Ohio State would have clinched if Minto had lost, but they would have been pretty darn close. And Minto not only extending the duel, but also ultimately extending this duel to the heavyweight level. And to me, if Nebraska had won this duel, we'd be talking way more glowingly about Minto and saying that, this win completely changed the math and completely changed the game for Nebraska, and ultimately really allowed them to win. Ferrari's win would have been huge if he had obviously picked up a win against Feldman. But for me, just Minto, the way he won, and the way he won knowing how he lost on Friday, and the way he won knowing who he's wrestling against, huge, huge win for Minto. So I really, really enjoyed watching that. I'm so excited to watch Minto in person a little bit later on in the year against Indiana. But nonetheless, a great performance from Minto, great performance from Nebraska. And it ultimately all led up to 285. And this is the third match that I want to talk about. Again, number 3, Nick Feldman of Ohio State against number 4, AJ Ferrari of Nebraska. Feldman ultimately wins 4-1 in sudden victory. There were early stall calls on both sides. That stalling point became a factor late, right? Feldman was going for takedowns, though. It's satisfying to me when this happens, because I do feel like Feldman deserved the win here. I do feel like Feldman ultimately deserved the points, and therefore Ohio State deserved the win, because, again, he was the one initiating more offense. Ferrari had his moments. He was still going for it, but Feldman was consistently coming after Ferrari. Ferrari, of course, defending well, but knowing that stalling could be the deciding factor in this one, and also kind of knowing that the officials were not going to let that be the case, unless it was blatantly obvious. It seemed like they weren't going to call stalling in sudden victory with the match on the line. And ultimately, I think the right wrestler won here. I think Feldman deserved this win. He was creating more offense. If it was like the UFC and you don't have sudden victory and you finish out the 3 periods or the 4 periods, or excuse me, yes, the 3 periods. I was thinking 5 because I was thinking about the 5 rounds in the UFC. That's why I was stumbling with my numbers there. But after the 3 periods, if you just had judges determine who deserves to win this one, I think they would have given it to Feldman after regular time, after regulation, just because Feldman was going after more offense. He seems more capable of scoring, and ultimately he proved that by obviously scoring in sudden victory. So I liked that, and I appreciated him ultimately winning and obviously taking it home for Ohio State. I was cheering for Nebraska just because I like it when the home crowd gets to see a win, and that's, of course, what we were able to see. That was not quite what we were able to see this time. Maybe it will be what we see later on in the year, but there's not very many duels left that are going to be wrestled in Lincoln. And this was one of the few. And obviously it's a loss against Iowa at home. It's a loss against Ohio State at home. Very disappointing for the fans there, who we know very much care about wrestling. But again, Feldman should have won. I appreciated that. Minto got a really nice win. And then looking back at Jesse Mendez, obviously a dominant win. And that's one you look at where if Hardy doesn't give up bonus points, maybe this is a different duel, but that's not the way it went. Hardy gave up bonus points, and obviously Ferrari was not able to win late. There's a lot of those little margins where you look at, if you go back to the matches, you parse through them, you think, wow, Nebraska could have won if this went this way, if this went the other way, and that's not what happened. It's not the case, and Ohio State comes away with a major victory. So a tough weekend for Nebraska. There were highlights. There were definitely silver linings. I think Minto's win is a major silver lining, but again, just a tricky duel for Nebraska, a tricky weekend for Nebraska. And I'm glad we got to talk about them because I spent a lot of time watching them, and I'm interested to watch them again throughout the season. They obviously take on Penn State coming up pretty soon. And I'm interested in them. I'm interested in this Nebraska team, and I'm interested to see how the rest of the season plays out for the Cornhuskers. Let's move on now and talk about women's basketball real quick before we get out of here. I want to talk about IU women's basketball. They play tonight. I think I'm going to go in person just as a fan. A little bit apprehensive about it because, walking through the cold, I imagine, could be a little bit tricky. But probably going to go. There's going to be a point where I can't anymore. There's going to be a point where the season ends, and obviously it'd be good to have these experiences now while I can. IU women's basketball 69, Purdue women's basketball 80 in West Lafayette in Mackey Arena. I was not there. I know a lot of people that normally would have been there and weren't there because of the weather. It was obviously very, very bad this weekend. Fortunately, they were still able to hold this game, although the crowd was a little bit smaller than usual. And this loss was particularly heartbreaking for Indiana because of how winnable it was. I'm talking with people that are, pretty closely in tune with Indiana women's basketball, and the sentiment was kind of like, wow, this team is lucky that it gets to play Purdue twice because in theory that's 2 wins, and this first one on the road was definitely not a win. I'm excited to watch these teams play again because, again, on the women's side, you really just play every team once. In this case, Indiana plays Purdue twice, and that's, I believe, the only team that they do play twice. So you watch a game happen, and, like the Ohio State game, missed opportunity for Indiana. I'd love to see that game played in Bloomington, but it can't be, right? So this Purdue game, though, is a little bit of a different story. Very soon, actually, Indiana's going to play Purdue inside Assembly Hall, and it'll be entertaining to see how much different that game is at a different venue. It'll be different. It'll be interesting to see how much different that game is after time has passed, and maybe teams improve or get worse if injuries occur or whatever else. And so that'll be fascinating. But this one in West Lafayette, which was also, in theory, very winnable, was not ultimately won by the Hoosiers. The primary takeaway here is, once again, Shea Chesky is the lone excellent performer, right? She had over 30, I think 37 by the end of this one, and not enough. She scored over half of the team's points overall. That speaks to the supporting cast offense issue, and the offense is flowing through Chesky. Purdue didn't defend her very well, or Purdue didn't defend her well enough. Chesky's still able to score. She's still able to grab her points. And again, without her, I have no idea where this team would be because she scored over half of the team's points on the road against Purdue. Indiana scored 69. I believe Shea Chesky scored 37. If not, it's similar in the high 30s there. Purdue played great in transition, and they were gifted by Indiana turnovers. Honestly, I wrote this down, it felt like it was difficult for Indiana to string together good passes, not even good possessions, but to have one nice pass and then another nice pass and then a third nice pass on one possession was a rarity. Oftentimes it was one nice pass and then a turnover, one easy pass, one nice pass and then a turnover, or just a turnover right away, which occurred oftentimes. And again, these are very avoidable turnovers. It wasn't even really Purdue blanketing the perimeter, although they did do some of that and force some turnovers in a nice way. But for the most part, this is Indiana giving up the basketball. And Purdue played great in transition. They ultimately had 27 points off turnovers. That is a lot, and that is a great way to lose, right? The 27 points off turnovers probably means you're losing, especially when you pair that with the fact that, again, Chesky had one player, Shea Chesky, had over half of Indiana's points offensively. So not a great performance. Again, Purdue great in transition. They also created offense and ultimately were able to score 80, which is a big deal, especially for a team that loses more games than it wins. Purdue, though, has had some great moments. They upset Washington. They've had some great moments throughout the season so far. But regardless, right? Great in transition. Great dribble penetration, creating open shots around the perimeter. Way too many open threes for Purdue. Some of it was Indiana's defense. A lot of it was Purdue just, again, creating offense in a great way. I was super impressed with the way they were able to work together and create open shots, find those open shots, and ultimately knock down those open shots. So Purdue looked great offensively in those two categories. They also shot better as the game went on. This one was close early. A lot of that was just because Purdue wasn't shooting very well. But again, as the game went on, that kind of shifted. To the point where eventually Purdue is, obviously shooting great and putting together great offense, and they took over the game in the second quarter. A lot of times teams take over games in the third quarter against Indiana. Purdue was able to do it in the second quarter. Very, very important for the Boilermakers. And again, Chesky over half the team scoring, Purdue 27 points off turnovers. That's really all you have to know about this game. Not a very good one. Much of the fourth quarter was garbage time, and ultimately, again, Indiana not quite able to come on top and get it done against Purdue. They play Michigan tonight. They also play Northwestern on Sunday afternoon. That game against Northwestern is a huge deal. I don't know how much that's understood, but keep in mind, there's 18 teams in the Big Ten, and only 15 of them make the Big Ten tournament. Indiana is outside of that top 15 at the moment. Penn State's 0-11. They're probably definitely not going to make it. I know Rutgers is somewhere in there. I still need to watch their game against Oregon from last night, and we'll probably talk about it on the show next time we have a show. But Rutgers is down there in a similar area. Purdue's probably okay, but Northwestern is right there on the fringes, right? A couple wins. They have 1 or 2 wins more than Indiana. And if Indiana doesn't win that one and get the tiebreaker in part because of that, they might have a very difficult time catching up. Keep in mind, they play Rutgers and Penn State, as everyone does, but they play them last. Those are the last 2 games. So Indiana, if they're out of reach of the Big Ten tournament by the time they play Rutgers and Penn State, then clearly you know something is very, very wrong. This Northwestern game's huge because not only is it a winnable game, especially at home, I'll almost definitely be there, but also it's a situation where if you don't have the tiebreaker, you put yourself even further out of Big Ten tournament contention. So huge game for the Big Ten tournament race between Indiana and Northwestern on Sunday. Just unbelievable, unbelievable. They play Michigan tonight. It's probably going to go very poorly for Indiana, although, hey, they almost upset Iowa, or they had a chance to upset Iowa if they played a little bit better in the second half here in Assembly Hall. So maybe the same occurs against Michigan. We'll have to wait and see. Either way, Indiana looking to still pick up its first win in the Big Ten. Great opportunity this weekend against Northwestern if it does not happen tonight against Michigan. All right. A little bit of a shorter episode today. I appreciate you all tuning in. I appreciate you all bearing with the schedule complications that have to do with the winter storm and things of that nature. Possibly a show tomorrow morning on which we could talk about this women's basketball game. We could talk about Rutgers women's basketball from last night, which I still need to watch their game against Oregon. Impressively, I haven't gotten it spoiled for me yet. And if that's not the case, then certainly next week we'll look to see if there's a possibility for a show on Monday, Tuesday, or throughout the week. At various times as well. Thank you very much for tuning in. You're watching or listening to The Andrew Garrison Show, and I, again, appreciate everything, especially if you've watched or listened all the way through to this point. I look forward to the rest of the season. I look forward to the next show, and I look forward to the women's basketball and wrestling that there is to watch the rest of the season, and particularly this weekend. Thank you so much. My name is Andrew Garrison. You're watching and or listening to The Andrew Garrison Show, and I will talk to you again next time.